They didn't survive because they had better weapons. They didn't survive because they had more soldiers. They survived because someone noticed a clothesline. In the winter of 1944, American troops in the Ardennes were blind. No drones, no satellites, radio contact, unreliable. German ambushes came out of forests. Entire units could be wiped out before they even knew an attack had begun. And yet, in one sector of the front, something strange kept happening. German assaults failed. Ambushes were anticipated. American defenses were ready just minutes before attacks began, not because of intelligence officers, not because of patterns hanging in plain sight. A white sheet, then two, sometimes a red cloth, sometimes nothing at all. To any German soldier, it looked like laundry. To American eyes, it became a warning system. The person behind it wasn't a trained operative. She wasn't armed. She didn't carry messages or radios. She was 16 years old. This is the story of how one teenage girl turned an ordinary household routine into an intelligence signal that warned Americans of German ambushes, shifted the outcome of a critical fight, and revealed something most histories overlook: that wars are not only decided by generals, tanks, or grand strategies. Sometimes they are decided by small, deliberate actions hidden in plain sight, actions so ordinary that the enemy never thinks to question them. And once you understand how this worked, you'll never look at civilian life in wartime the same way again. If this story sounds impossible, stay with me, because every detail you're about to hear actually mattered on the battlefield. By December 1944, the American army in Western Europe was facing a problem it had not planned for. Not a shortage of courage, not a lack of fire, but blindness. The Ardennes region was never supposed to become the center of the war. It was rugged, forested, cut by narrow roads and small villages, and considered unsuitable for a major offensive. That assumption shaped everything. Defensive lines were thin. Units were spread wide. Intelligence coverage was light. Command believed the terrain itself would slow any serious German push. When German forces launched their surprise offensive, American units suddenly found themselves fighting in an environment where traditional advantages failed. Fog erased visibility, snow muted movement. Radio communication broke down constantly. Reconnaissance patrols disappeared and did not return. In this environment, ambush became the dominant weapon. German units did not need to overwhelm American positions. They only needed to appear suddenly, strike fast, and vanish again. A plateau could be pinned down or wiped out before commanders even understood what was happening. Convoys were hit without warning. Entire sector operated on instinct rather than information. For the American soldiers on the ground, the most dangerous question was always the same: where are they? Normally, armies answer that question through layered intelligence. Forward observers. But in the Ardennes, those systems failed one by one. Air could not fly consistently due to weather. Radios struggled in wooded terrain. Patrols could not move without drawing fire. Even civilians were often too frightened to speak, or simply did not know what they were seeing. Information arrived late, if it arrived at all. And late information is often worse than no information. It only explains it. This is the context that matters, because without understanding this tactical vacuum, the story that follows makes no sense. American defensive positions in the Ardennes were often improvised. Small units occupied stone buildings, ridge lines, or hastily dug foxholes. Reinforcements were delayed by weather and enemy pressure. Every hour of warning mattered, not hours of planning, not days of preparation, sometimes just minutes. Knowing that an attack was coming could mean the difference between men eating breakfast with rifles stacked nearby and men caught off guard, half asleep, scrambling under fire. It could mean machine guns positioned correctly instead of pointed the wrong way. It could mean holding fire until the enemy committed instead of panicking too early. But warnings require sources, and this was the deeper problem the American command faced. They were surrounded by people but isolated from information. Roads passed through civilian areas, farms, bakeries, churches, and town halls became temporary quarters for occupying forces. German patrols moved openly through places that American soldiers could only observe. From a distance, civilians saw things soldiers could not. They noticed when troops assembled unusually early. They noticed patterns of movement that repeated day after day, but civilians were not trained intelligence assets. They had no radios, no codes, no safe way to report what they saw. Approaching American positions could get them killed. Being seen communicating could draw suspicion. So most civilians did what survival demanded. They stayed quiet, they stayed invisible, they waited. From a military perspective, this created a paradox. The best intelligence was often closest to the enemy, but the people who possessed it had the least ability to share it. This was not a failure of bravery, it was a failure of structure. Organized resistance networks existed, but they took time to build. They required trust, couriers, contacts, and coordination. In fast-moving combat zones, especially during surprise offensives, those networks lagged behind events. By the time information traveled upward, the situation on the ground had already changed. The Ardennes offensive moved faster than intelligence systems could adapt, which meant that American units were forced to rely on something far more fragile. They watched villages through binoculars and rifle scopes. They searched for anything that broke routine, a truck arriving at the wrong hour, troops assembling where none had gathered before, unusual movement in places that should have been quiet most of the time. Those signs came too late, but a soldier, not a vehicle, not a weapon, a pattern. At first it did not look like intelligence at all. It looked like normal life continuing under occupation. Ordinary routine carried out by people trying to survive another day, the kind of activity that blended into the background so completely that no one thought to question it. Because German forces watched for radios, couriers, and resistance fighters. They watched for men of fighting age moving suspiciously. They watched for hidden weapons, secret meetings, and coded messages. They did not watch laundry. They did not question it. They did not disrupt it. They did not imagine it could mean anything. But on one stretch of the front, American soldiers began to notice something they could not explain. Warnings that came without messengers, preparation that happened just in time, attack that failed not because they were weak, but because they were anticipated. No reports had been filed, yet somehow, information was crossing the gap. What they were seeing was not a resistance network in the traditional sense. It was not formal intelligence. It was something improvised, fragile, and almost absurd in its simplicity, a system that worked precisely because it did not look like one. And it began with a single civilian routine that no one thought to challenge. At first, the Americans could not explain what they were seeing. There was no report, no captured document, no intercepted transmission. Yet something kept disrupting. German timing attack arrived when defenses were ready. Patrols walked into prepared fields of fire. Movements that should have gone unnoticed were anticipated with uncomfortable precision. Soldiers who survived long enough learned to recognize the difference. Coincidence happens once, patterns repeat. The men on observation duty began to compare notes, not formally, not in after-action reports, but in the way soldiers always do when something feels wrong. Quiet conversations, shared glances. Why did they always seem ready? Why did the warning come just before movement? Why did it keep happening near the same cluster of buildings? The answer did not come from intelligence officers. It came from boredom and repetition. Watching the same village for hours forces your mind to know which doors open most often, which paths are used, which routine remained constant, even under occupation. And one routine stood out precisely because it never stopped. Laundry every morning, at roughly the same time. Items appeared on a clothesline, behind a farmhouse on slightly elevated ground. Sheets, blankets, tablecloths. Sometimes only one, sometimes several. Civilians washed clothes, that was normal. Even under occupation, life continued in fragments. German soldiers did not interfere with such things unless they had a reason. But then the timing began to matter. On days when nothing happened, the line was simple. On days when patrols moved through the village, the arrangement changed. On days when larger movements followed, something appeared early or disappeared entirely. It was subtle enough to be ignored. And that was the danger. The human brain is trained to filter out normalcy. We notice weapons, uniforms, vehicles. We are conditional safety, not threat. German soldiers did the same. American soldiers, watching from a distance, began to suspect that this normal activity was anything but. The realization did not arrive as certainty. It arrived as discomfort. Why was the line visible from multiple angles of approach? Why did it sit almost perfectly between German assembly areas and American defensive positions? Why did the changes seem to precede enemy movement rather than follow it? No one said the word intelligence out loud. That would have sounded ridiculous. What if someone is watching for us? What if this is intentional? What if this is meant to be seen? The danger of such thinking was obvious. Misinterpretation could be fatal. Acting on imagined signals could waste ammunition, reveal positions, or cause panic, sold alarms, and wishful thinking. So they waited. They watched longer. They recorded mentally, not on paper, what appeared and when. They compared it against known enemy activity. They tested their assumptions without committing to them, and slowly the pattern hardened. Certain arrangements coincided with patrol movement. Certain colors appeared before vehicle noise was heard. Certain absences preceded attacks more often than chance would allow. This was not a code in the traditional sense. No key had been exchanged. No agreement had been made. It was an inference-based system, meaning emerged. Someone on the other side was observing the same battlefield from a civilian angle. Someone who could see what soldiers could not, from windows, from doorways, from routine movement through streets occupied by the enemy. That person had no weapon, no uniform, no authority, but they had something more dangerous. They could see troops assembling before dawn. They could observe which buildings officers entered and how long they stayed. They could tell the difference between routine patrols and units preparing for something larger. And they could do it without raising suspicion, because everything they did looked harmless. A civilian signaling system only works if it remains invisible to those who do not know how to look. The moment it is recognized as intelligence, it collapses. There is no second chance, no plausible deniability. Once suspicion takes hold, which meant that whoever was behind the clothesline understood something fundamental. That survival depended not on secrecy alone, but on appearing boring. German counterintelligence focused on disruption. Radios were seized, couriers were followed, resistance cells were infiltrated. Suspicious behavior was punished immediately and publicly. Laundry was beneath notice. No German officer would report a clothesline. No commander would divert resources to investigate household routine. The system exploited that blind spot, but for the Americans, recognizing it created a new problem. Understanding that information might be flowing was one thing, trusting it was another. If they acted too aggressively, they risked exposing the source. If they ignored it, they risked walking into an ambush they had been warned about. Every decision now carried weight beyond tactics, because this was not just about winning a firefight. It was about whether to accept help from someone who had no protection if things went wrong. Someone who, if discovered, would not be captured as a soldier. They would be executed as a civilian. This raised a question no field manual could answer. How much could they ask of someone who had not chosen to be part of the war, but had been dragged into it by proximity? The clothesline did not answer that question. It simply kept appearing, changing, repeating, signaling without words. And eventually the Americans had to decide. Either it was noise and they would ignore it, or it was meaning and they would trust it. The next time the pattern appeared, they would find out which one it was. Once the Americans accepted that the pattern was real, a new question emerged. How did it work? Not emotionally, not symbolically, but mechanically, because no intelligence system survives on good intentions alone. It survives on clarity, consistency, and limits. The clothesline did not function like a codebook. What existed instead was something far more adaptive. A signaling language built on constraints. The first constraint was visibility. The line had to be seen from American observation points, but not from German positions, in a way that suggested purpose. That meant placement mattered. The items could not be arranged in a way that looked deliberate to someone standing nearby, only to someone watching from a distance. To a German patrol passing through the village, it was just laundry. To an American soldier with binoculars trained on the same spot every day, it became data. Every item used had to belong there. Sheets, blankets, tablecloths, curtains. Nothing that would raise questions, nothing new or unusual. The system could not introduce foreign elements without collapsing. This ruled out complexity. No knots, no symbols, no markings that already existed in daily life. The third constraint was frequencies. Laundry could not appear only when danger was present. That would be obvious. It had to appear regularly even when nothing was happening. Normal days created baseline noise. Only against that background could variation carry meaning. This is where the system became sophisticated, because the cibiation. Something appearing earlier than usual or not appearing at all. Meaning came from difference, not from display. The Americans began to test this logic cautiously. They did not act immediately on every change. Instead, they compared signals against known enemy movement. When trucks were heard later in the day, when patrols appeared unexpectedly, they reviewed what had been visible that morning. Over time, correlation sharpened. Multiple white items tended to precede. Increased foot patrols, half-free fabrics coincided with vehicle movement. Color, rare under normal circumstances, appeared before larger form and soul. It was reliability. The signals did not need to tell the Americans everything. They only needed to tell them enough. Danger or no danger, small movement or large foot soldiers or vehicles. Soon or not yet in combat, those distinctions are often sufficient. Knowing that an attack is coming does not require knowing the exact hour. It requires time to shift posture, to wake men, to reposition weapons, to change the angle of defense. Minutes matter more than details. The clothesline provided minutes. It also provided something equally valuable: consistency without communication. The civilian behind the system did not need confirmation. She did not need feedback. She did not know whether the Americans understood her signals or ignored them entirely. The system did not depend on acknowledgement that made it resilient. If contact had been required, the risk would have multiplied. Messengers could be captured. Questions could lead to suspicion. The clothesline avoided all of that. It spoke without speaking. From the American side, this created a delicate balance. They could not adjust the system openly. They could not suggest changes. They could not ask for clarification. They had to interpret what they were given and accept uncertainty. Soldiers learned to treat the signals as indicators, not orders. They did not abandon positions based on laundry. They did not advance based on it. They used it to raise readiness, not to dictate action. This distinction kept the system from becoming dangerous. Had the Americans treated the signals as absolute truth, a single misinterpretation could have led to disaster. A false alarm might have revealed positions or wasted limited ammunition. An overreaction could have drawn attention to the source. Instead, they used the signals the way good intelligence is used, as a warning, not a command. On the civilian side, the system also evolved. Not every observation needed to be communicated, only changes that suggested intent, only preparations that broke routine. This reduced noise. Reporting everything is the fastest way to report nothing. By focusing on deviations, the signals gained clarity. By remain safe, it did not seek precision beyond what could be supported. It did not attempt to replace military intelligence. It filled a gap, a narrow one, but at exactly the right place. German forces never noticed, because there was nothing to notice. No transmissions, no meetings, no suspicious movement. From their perspective, civilians behaved as civilians always had. Laundry appeared, changed with weather and need. Even if a German officer had suspected something, proving it would have been nearly impossible, what exactly would he report? That a girl hung different sheets on different days? Occupation systems are designed to suppress threats, not to interrogate domestic randomness. Suspicion requires justification, which meant the system could persist as long as no one did something foolish. That is why restraint mattered as much as creativity. On days when German presence intensified, the signals became deliberately dull, simpler arrangements, nothing that stood out, Survival sometimes meant saying nothing at all. Silence was part of the language. This restraint saved the system more than once because the greatest threat to any improvised intelligence method is not the enemy. It is success. Success breeds attention. Attention breeds curiosity, leads to scrutiny. The clothesline avoided that trap by never appearing successful. From the outside, nothing changed. By the time the Americans fully understood what they were looking at, the system had already proven its value multiple times. Defensive positions had been adjusted. Men had been awake when they needed to be awake. Attack had met prepared resistance instead of surprise. The laundry did not win battles. It prevented disasters. And in the Ardennes, that distinction mattered more than victory, because holding ground often meant nothing more than surviving the next assault. The next time the line changed, the Americans were no longer asking whether it meant something. They were asking a far more dangerous question. The warning did not arrive with drama. There was no messenger, no knock on a door, no whispered report. It arrived the same way all the others had. Quietly before dawn, the clothesline changed. To an untrained eye, it looked unremarkable, ordinary fabric arranged in an ordinary place. But to the Americans watching from their observation points, it was different enough to matter. Not subtle, not ambiguous, definitive. This was not routine movement, this was preparation. The difference mattered because the stakes had changed. In the days leading up to this moment, German activity in the area. Units lingered longer in the village. Vehicles appeared and disappeared at odd hours. None of it confirmed an imminent attack on its own, but together it suggested intent. The clothesline removed doubt. It indicated scale. It indicated urgency. And most importantly, it appeared earlier than expected. This gave the Americans something they almost never had in the Ardennes. Time, not enough to call in major reinforcements, not enough to reorganize the front, but enough to do the only thing that mattered. Prepare. The response was immediate but controlled. No flares, no unnecessary movement, no obvious changes that could be observed from a distance. Men were woken quietly, weapons were checked, ammunition redistributed. Machine guns were repositioned to create overlapping fields of fire rather than isolated points of resistance. Grenades were placed where they could be reached without fumbling. Orders were simple: hold positions, conserve ammunition, do not fire until contact is confirmed. The Americans understood that if the warning was correct, surprise would now work in their favor. German units, expecting disorganized resistance, would advance confidently. That confidence could be turned against them. But there was no certainty if the signal was wrong. The Americans risked exhaustion, wasted readiness, and exposure. In winter conditions, staying alert for hours without contact drained strength quickly. False alarms could degrade morale and discipline. Trusting the signal meant accepting responsibility for its consequences. As the light began to rise, movement appeared at the edge of the village. German troops assembled in formations that confirmed what the clothesline had suggested. Officers moved among the ranks. This was not a patrol. It was an assault. The Germans advanced with speed and confidence. They expected to catch the Americans unprepared. They were wrong. When the first elements entered the killing zone, American weapons opened fire. Ragey. Fields of fire overlapped exactly where they needed to. The effect was immediate. The German advance stalled, not because it lacked numbers, but because it had lost surprise. Units hesitated, officers struggled to adapt to resistance that appeared stronger, and instead of shock elements. The engagement lasted hours. Each time they encountered defenders who were already in position, already braced, already ready. What should have been a breakthrough became a grinding failure. Eventually the Germans withdrew, not routed, not destroyed, but denied momentum, denied advantage, denied the easy victory surprise was meant to deliver. A thin American defensive line held against a force that should have overwhelmed it. Casualties were minimized. Possessions remained intact. The sector did not collapse. But the true significance lay elsewhere. Question that the system worked. The clothesline had not merely predicted activity, it had provided actionable warning. This changed everything. The signal was no longer a curiosity or a possibility. It became a factor in planning, a quiet one, an unofficial one. but one that could not be ignored. At the same time, the risk escalated. Success draws attention. German commanders began asking why attacks in this sector kept failing. Why defenses appeared prepared despite limited American reconnaissance capabilities. Increased scrutiny followed. Patrols lingered longer in the village. Civilians were watched more closely. Routines were observed instead of ignored. The margin for error narrowed on the civilian side. Each failure of a German operation raised questions. The clothesline could not become predictable. It could not become perfect. Imperfection became a form of camouflage. Some days the signals were deliberately muted. Other days they reflected only partial information. Silence was used when clarity would have been too dangerous. Because intelligence is not about telling everything. It is about telling what can be told safely. The Americans adjusted as well. They stopped relying on the signals as confirmation and began using them as early alerts. They avoided reacting too visibly. They ensured that readiness changes were subtle enough not to reveal the source. But the balance was fragile. One misstep, one pattern noticed too clearly, one accusation made without evidence, and the system would collapse. The clothesline had succeeded where radios and scouts had failed, but it remained defenseless. No weapon protected it. Only the assumption that ordinary life was meaningless. That assumption had already been exploited once. Whether it could survive being exploited again was no longer certain. After the failed assault, the battlefield quieted, but the war did not. German units withdrew, regrouped, and adapted. They always did. What they could not explain was why resistance in this sector seemed consistently prepared despite limited American reconnaissance. Not dramatic ones, not accusations. Why here? Why again? Why just in time? In occupation, warfare, unanswered questions do not remain unanswered for long. They lead to observation. Observation leads to suspicion, and suspicion does not require proof to be deadly. German counterintelligence did not need to know what the system was. They only needed to know that something was wrong. So they watched. Patrols slowed, routes changed, soldiers lingered in places they once passed through quickly. Civilians who had blended into the background were now being noticed, not because they acted strangely, but because someone was finally paying attention. This was the moment when the clothesline became most vulnerable, not because it changed, but because it had worked. It creates ripples that travel outward until they touch people who were never meant to notice the cause. The civilian behind the signals understood this instinctively. Survival under occupation teaches one lesson above all others. Consistency attracts death. So the system adjusted error. Arrangements simplified. Days passed with nothing remarkable displayed. To an American observer, this silence could have been alarming, but it was not interpreted as failure. It was understood as restraint. The absence of information became information. It suggested scrutiny. It suggested danger. It suggested that pushing harder would risk exposure. This mutual understanding, unspoken and unofficial, preserved the system when it could have collapsed. But restraint carries its own cost. During these quieter days, German patrol activity increased without warning, without clear signals. American units were forced to rely again on their own limited observation. Tension returned. Uncertainty crept back into every decision. This was the price of survival. You either risk exposure by speaking too clearly, or you accept blindness to remain alive. The system walked that line carefully. Then came the moment everyone feared. A German officer began watching the farmhouse, not openly, not aggressively, methodically from a distance for hours at a time. He did not need to accuse, he only needed to observe patterns long enough to notice that there were patterns at all. For several days, laundry appeared as it always had, simple, unremarkable. The system retreated into invisibility. From the American side, the silence confirmed the worst, was no longer guaranteed. Acting on them now could endanger the source irreversibly. This forced a difficult decision. Continue relying on a system that might already be compromised, or stop entirely, knowing that doing so removed one of the few early warning advantages they had. They chose caution. Readiness was maintained at a higher baseline. Patrols were adjusted, defensive positions were strengthened quietly. The clothesline was no longer treated as a primary indicator. But it was not forgotten. A sudden clash elsewhere pulled German attention away. Casualties demanded response. Orders changed. The officer watching the farmhouse was reassigned. Surveillance loosened, not because suspicion had faded, but because priority and shift system spoke again. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough. The signal did not describe. It meant that the source itself had been under observation. This was a warning of a different kind. It told the Americans not only what the Germans were doing, but what the Germans might be thinking. It suggested that the system could not continue indefinitely in its current form. This transformed the problem. The clothesline had reached the limits of what it could safely do. It had been effective because it was passive, indirect, and invisible. But prolonged success threatened those very qualities. Remaining static would lead to discovery. Expanding the system would accelerate it. A transition was inevitable. The Americans now had to consider how to protect a source they had never formally recruited, never trained, and never acknowledged. They could not send instructions, they could not send protection, they could not promise extraction without exposing the system further. What they could do was prepare for change. This is where the story shifts. Not toward escalation, but toward adaptation. The clothesline had bought time. Time could now be used to build something more durable, something that did not rely on visibility alone, something that could survive scrutiny. The next phase would move beyond silent signals. It would require movement, risk, and it would raise the stakes higher than they had ever been before. Because once civilians move from signaling to carrying information, the war no longer passes by their doorstep, it enters their hands. The clothesline did not win the war. It did not stop the German offensive. It did not alter grand strategy. It did not appear in official after-action reports or command summaries. Its impact was smaller, and that is precisely why it mattered. In warfare, not every influence needs to be decisive to be meaningful. Some only need to be timely. The intelligence provided by the clothesline changed one thing above all others. Reaction. Time. American units in this sector did not suddenly gain superior firepower or numbers. What they gained was awareness, the difference between being surprising under fire and waiting behind cover. That difference saved lives. Prepared defenders fire more accurately. They waste less ammunition. They panic less. They survive longer. From a tactical perspective, the effect was cumulative rather than dramatic. Each avoided ambush preserved manpower. Each failed German assault consumed enemy resources without gaining ground. The Ardennes offensive relied on speed and confusion. When resistance stiffened unexpectedly, schedules broke down, units hesitated, attacks that were meant to roll forward stalled, and required reassessment. This did not collapse the German plan, but it contributed to friction, and friction is how offensives die. For the Americans, holding ground during the most chaotic phase of the fighting mattered more than counterattacking. Chablis allowed reinforcements to arrive. It allowed command to reassert control. It allowed the front to solidify instead of unravel. The clothesline helped buy that time, but its contribution must be understood. It did not flood commanders with detail. It did not attempt to replace reconnaissance. It did not promise certainty. It only answered the most urgent question soldiers faced. Is something coming? That alone was enough. Equally important is what the system did not change. It did not remove risk. It did not guarantee safety. American units still fought under brutal conditions. Men were still killed. Positions were still lost and retaken. The cold still claimed fingers and toes. Confusion still ruled many engagements. The clothesline did not transform the Ardennes into a controlled battered. Stories that exaggerate civilian intelligence into decisive turning points, misunderstand how war actually works. Large outcomes emerge from accumulated advantages. Not singular miracles, the clothesline was one of many small factors that nudged events away from catastrophe. Radios, reports, chains of command. When those channels collapse, something fills the vacuum: improvisation. The clothesline was improvisation in its purest form. It did not arise from planning. It arose from necessity, from the realization that improvisation without communication. The assumption that ordinary life is strategically irrelevant. That assumption is usually correct. Most civilian activity does not matter militarily, but because it is ignored, it becomes the perfect hiding place for meaning when someone chooses to put meaning there. This is why the system worked. As the front moved east and the intensity of combat shifted, the need for the clothesline diminished. Formal intelligence networks expanded, couriers became viable, resistance groups established safer routes. American command regained the ability to observe and plan more effectively. The clothesline receded into irrelevance. That too is an important lesson. Effective wartime improvisations are often temporary. They solve immediate problems, then disappear. They leave few records. They are rarely celebrated, but they shape outcomes quietly for the civilian involved. The end of the system did not bring closure. There was no ceremony. The risk faded gradually as the front moved on, leaving behind only memory and routine. Laundry returned to being laundry. From the American perspective, the episode reinforced something soldiers already knew instinctively: that intelligence does not always come from headquarters, that reliable information often arrives from unexpected places. It also highlighted an uncomfortable truth that civilians often carry risks they did not choose. The clothesline worked because a civilian chose to act without protection, without authority, and without assurance that her efforts would matter. The military benefited from that choice without being able to fully safeguard the person making it. It is rarely acknowledged. In official histories, civilian contributions are summarized vaguely or omitted entirely, not out of malice but because they do not fit cleanly into operational narratives. They resist quantification. They cannot be trapped or institutionalized easily. But they exist. The clothesline did not change the direction of armies. It changed moments. Moments where men were awake instead of asleep. Moments where weapons were pointed the right way. Moments where survival edged out surprise. Those moments accumulated, and in the Ardennes, accumulation was enough. If this story changed how you think about World War II, let me know in the comments. And if you want more untold moments like this, consider subscribing.